Welcome, everyone. My name is Govind. I'm the CUPE researcher for the Atlantic region, and I'm happy to have you join us tonight for our webinar on a worker-centric economic recovery in Nova Scotia. I will introduce our panelists in a second, but I'd first ask CUPE Nova Scotia President Nan McFadyen to say a few words. Thank you. Nan.
Hello, everyone. On behalf of the CUPE Nova Scotia Executive, I want to welcome you to our second webinar in our series titled Worker-Centric Economic Recovery. We very much appreciate you taking your evening to share in this conversation, and I'll hand it over to Govind.
Thank you, Nan, and thank you to CUPE Nova Scotia for sponsoring this discussion. It's really, I think it's going to be a really great discussion tonight. So we have three wonderful panelists with us tonight. The first that I'll introduce is Christine Saulnier. She's the Nova Scotia Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. She has a doctorate in political science from York University, and she leads the living wage calculations for communities in Atlantic Canada, and has served as co-author of the annual Child and Family Poverty Report Cards for Nova Scotia. She's a frequent media commentator on fiscal policy, minimum wage, and a range of social policies, including childcare and income assistance. Welcome, Christine. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks.
Second, we have Jason Edwards, who is a labor and employment lawyer practicing in Halifax. He's a volunteer with the Halifax Workers Action Centre, which hosts free monthly legal information clinics. Before attending law school, Jason worked as an organizer helping low-wage and precarious workers build their collective power. Welcome, Jason. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Govind.
And our third panelist tonight is Asaf Rashid, who is a lawyer on temporary leave from practice while working as a union organizer with the Public Service Alliance of Canada here in Halifax. He's an organizer with the Halifax Workers Action Centre, which assists vulnerable and non-unionized workers in their fights for workplace justice. He works with a number of advocates for migrant worker rights in pushing Nova Scotia for better protections and rights and permanent resident status. He's currently co-authoring a book on prisoner worker labor rights and unionization. Asaf practiced law in the Toronto area before moving back to Halifax, working mostly on criminal defense and immigration law. In the last 20 years, he has spent time in Fredericton, Halifax, Toronto, and Calgary, where he has been involved in campaigns for justice for migrants and refugees, union organizing, and other working class justice campaigns. So welcome, Asaf.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Yeah. So how we're going to work the webinar tonight is that I'm going to start by starting a conversation with our panelists and posing them a couple of questions. And then I'd ask people who are all of our participants watching to type into the chat window any of their questions, because after about 35 minutes of the webinar or so, we're going to go to the questions from our audience. And I'll pose those questions. So I'll be watching the chat window, and I'll be posing those questions to our panelists. We had tried to arrange for closed captioning on our webinar. Hopefully that will kick in at a certain point. But when we do post this to the CUPE Nova Scotia YouTube channel, we will hopefully have captions on it. So to begin, I think let's jump right in. The question that I'll ask the panelists as a starting question is, what does a worker-centric recovery from the COVID or the pandemic look like to you? And maybe I'll throw it to Christine to start.
Thanks, Govind. When I was thinking about this seminar, I decided I would tell everyone a story. So, you know, the pandemic has really exposed who and what counts in our economy and our society, who is actually an essential worker. And that undervalued paid and indeed unpaid care actually underpins the entire system. The pandemic has exposed inequities and injustices. But what I would argue that we really need to expose is that the pandemic came at a time marked by perhaps the height of a deliberate strategy to shift more wealth to the wealthiest, something that took hold in Canada way back in the mid-90s, and I would say with the Paul Martin budget. This strategy involved many things. It included an attack on workers and public services. And it's a strategy that has been taken up by successive governments at all levels that have really used fear-mongering, including about the debt and the deficit, to make it very difficult for us to kind of connect the dots. And we have to connect the dots if we want to ensure that the recovery is not business as usual. So I thought I would help us connect the dots. So the story that underpins that strategy goes something like this. The ideal society for the powerful is one where we as individuals are able to purchase whatever we need, indeed whatever we want, in the marketplace, unencumbered. In fact, it is the only place we are supposed to get, not for free, not from government, but as individuals buying it. Whatever we need includes the basics of food, shelter, clothing, transportation, but also education, healthcare, or other services. And in order to unleash our ability to do so, we must be rid of what? Of what might interfere with our ability to do so. Those interferences include regulations on what, how, and by whom goods and services can be produced, sold, and purchased in that marketplace. We sometimes hear these regulations called red tape. Other interferences, taxes, trade barriers, government, unions, employment standards. How about legislated minimum wages, environmental protections, human rights legislation, democracy? I'm sure you can name others that we are told are interfering with competition in the free market. If we allowed free competition, the story goes, well, that would result in lower costs, higher economic growth, and that would trickle down to all of us, who can then purchase what we need in the marketplace. Should we interfere in these transactions? Well then, prices will go up, wages will go down, growth will cease, and we will all be worse off. Furthermore, the story goes, the labor market is based solely on a fair valuation of your worth, your skills, and your education. You're not satisfied with your wages? You need only quit and get a different job, or perhaps get more education, or be a better negotiator. You need to make better choices, whatever that comes to. Your job, your health, your wealth. Much smaller government, it might help the deserving poor, who may also be supported by charity. I tell this story because I think we forget. It is a story that we are told to ensure that we are compliant. It is a story that we are told, and not often in its entirety, where we connect the dots about who benefits and who pays the costs. The result of this strategy is increased income inequality, where those at the top are benefiting immensely while the rest are left to fight over the crumbs. We resent those who have a few, like unionized workers. It's a story that has left us feeling uncertain, exhausted, stressed, alienated, cynical as we run in place to keep up. I would argue the very fabric of our society has been torn. So many no longer believe that we can come together and collectively support each other. We forget that the first crowd sharing was our tax system. Not only do so many not believe in our collective power, we are told to fear it, to fear when people take to the streets, to fear it when people stand up for their rights, because if we force employers to raise their wages, we will pay for it in price inflation or job loss. We can't have more unions because apparently they're self-interested and they may well destroy the economy. We can't have higher labor standards because, well, businesses will flee or they won't come here. We can't have rent control because, well, we will have a shortage of rental housing. We can't afford public services, we will go bankrupt. Sound familiar? The last thing that we were told in this story is that there is no alternative. Of course, there's an alternative, as CCPA likes to show you. The alternative is a recovery where no one is left behind. One that breaks down the barriers so that we all have more say, whether that's as in unions in our workplaces and input into decisions about our health and safety, or opportunities to really shape public policy that affect our everyday lives. My vision looks like this. You wake up in the morning, you have good quality, affordable home. You turn on your light, it comes from renewable energy produced by a crown corporation that we own. You eat locally grown food for breakfast, provided by a farmer who has a decent livelihood. You take free public transit, or you bike, or you have an electric car where you drive to your unionized job that pays you a living wage. Maybe you work at a public sector green job, providing health services, healthcare, childcare, you're an educator, or perhaps you even work in arts and culture at a living wage, or you build green infrastructure. Perhaps it's your weekday off because the work week is now 4 days. You are able to provide input into the new seniors residence. Maybe you're able to help your community figure out a way to build it so that everyone can live, work, and participate fully, whether that's because there's affordable housing, well-paid caregivers, accessible and flexible employment, expanded public health care, good pensions, income insecurity, and security. This is not utopian. We can all benefit if the wealth that exists is shared fairly and we build the solidarity. The solidarity we need to take care of each other and really push against the rich and the powerful. This is some of my vision. I look forward to hearing my panelists and having a discussion about what yours is. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christine. That's a great way to start the discussion, a broad vision. I like all the points in it. I think I might even add one of a public utility providing internet and phone service would be one that would save a lot of people a lot of money here in Nova Scotia, and is also topical. So hopefully we'll get into those sorts of specifics, and we will in the rest of the webinar. So maybe now I'll turn to Jason and see if you wanted to share with us some of the ways in which you think about what are the most important changes that need to occur. What does a worker-centric recovery mean to you?
The most important thing I would mention, the most important part of a worker-centric recovery and how we achieve that recovery is conceiving appropriately of what it means to be a worker. So historically, when unions do really, really well, non-union workers do really, really well. And when non-union workers do better, union workers do better as well. So I think when we're talking about recovery and talking about how we build a worker-centric recovery, we need to remember that what's good for one worker is good for another worker and vice versa. We can't conceive of workers as being separated into sort of classes of workers where union workers who have some job security are so much better off than non-union workers without job security. We need to remember as we move forward, and what we're going to see, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this, is the attacks on unions are going to percolate down to the attacks on non-union workers. And attacks on non-union workers are also bad for union workers. So historically, when one worker does better, all workers do better. When all workers do better, one worker does better. We need to remember that. So my hope would be that as we're moving forward talking about this, that we would consider of workers as one group. The other group is the ownership class, people who don't have to work because their investments are how they live. By already owning things, it's how they get by. The rest of us, the vast majority, and I would assume most of the people watching today, are people who have to work for a living to pay their bills. And so when one of us does well, we all do well. And that's the most important thing we need to remember as we're talking about building a worker-centric recovery and a worker-centric economy in general.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Jason. I mean, I think that that's, I think that you're putting your finger on the points that we're trying to get to today. It's about, there are a lot of people, I just heard on the 6 o'clock news, who are purchasing assets right now because they're sitting on a lot of money. The pandemic has actually they've done very well throughout the pandemic. And then there are the rest of the working class, or the rest of the 99% who are having a much harder time. So Asaf, what are your thoughts when you think about what does a worker-centric recovery look like, and what are the most important points to focus on?
So speaking about migrant workers specifically, just focusing in on a particular group of extremely vulnerable workers, there are approximately 2,000 migrant workers working in agriculture and fish farming this year. And 1,000s of migrant workers come to Nova Scotia every single year. It's been happening for quite some time. For there to be an inclusive worker-centered recovery, it has to respond to the demands of migrant workers that predated the pandemic. For years, they predated the pandemic. And those have been emphasized. So the issues, the injustices migrant workers face have just been emphasized during the pandemic, through which over 1,300 migrant farm workers alone have gotten sick with COVID-19 due to being forced to work and live in close quarters and having to travel to Canada because many were forced to return to their country of origin last year due to the conditions of their closed work permits, which forced them to do that. And they come back and they expose themselves. Completely unnecessary. 3 healthy migrant workers died from COVID-19 already. Now, in order to be able to do the work they were doing, they had to be healthy, and they died. That's horrific to think of that happening, but it did. Both the federal and provincial governments have the responsibility to make necessary changes, not just for health and safety due to COVID-19, but to address longstanding injustices that migrant worker advocates, migrant workers have been speaking about for years and years and have just fallen on deaf ears. The work of Justicia for Migrant Workers for about the last 20 years, and now the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, have documented countless abuses, including injured workers being sent home, basically medical repatriation. You get sick, injured, can't work, then they get sent back to their country of origin, being fired for complaining, working overtime with no pay because too afraid to say anything about it, and working with pesticides with no protection and getting sick while the supervisor and employer, who are Canadian citizens, they have full protective gear on. In June 2020, the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change released a report called Unheeded Warnings, based on over 1,000 complaints from migrant workers across the country, including 80 from Nova Scotia. The report emphasized migrant workers' demands for change. And in Nova Scotia, I'm part of a working group with a number of migrant justice advocates who have been in touch with migrant workers either directly or have been assisted by the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change report, which basically asserted what the demands were. And we're applying the demands for change to Nova Scotia. We put together an open letter signed by 36 organizations and unions in the province, including CUPE Nova Scotia. And I'll just highlight a few key demands. The main one, as has been the main demand for year after year, permanent residence on arrival, status for all. Well, this is a federal issue. I asked the question, why isn't the province joining the call for this change? If 2,000 migrant workers are in the province this year and thousands have been coming year after year, why isn't the province pushing for this? Clearly, this is not temporary. It's permanent that the workers are coming back year after year. No more temporary work permits where migrant workers are tied to their employer and have to face the super exploitation of working unpaid overtime and working themselves so hard they hurt their bodies just to hold on to their jobs. Just this past summer, there was a media report from Quebec which was talking about how migrant farm workers are 3 times more productive than Canadian or permanent resident workers doing the same job. And the way this is presented in the news is if this is, wow, this is amazing. Actually, this is a sign of super exploitation and overwork and likely a lot of unpaid work. Mm-hmm. So this has been a trend though, this whole idea of temporariness, which is now the norm, that most workers coming in that are coming into the immigration system are coming in temporarily, when prior to 2006, most were permanent. That was intentional to allow for exploitation. Also, what's needed is an accessible system for making labor standards complaints and other complaints that all other workers have access to. Migrant workers have noted that there's issues with having somebody who speaks their language when they're calling in to complain, or even having a process that's open at the times they're available, such as the weekend or very late in the evenings when they finally have a moment where they may be able to make a call. The system is dysfunctional for migrant workers. Unannounced inspections on these farms. This is essential. When farmers are told in advance that there's going to be an inspection, then workers are told, keep their mouths shut and tell the inspector everything is fine. And if you don't, you face consequences. And the practice of being confined to farms. This is another issue that's happened in Nova Scotia. This is not, I'm not talking about quarantine. I'm talking about after quarantine is done, being told you can't leave the farm. That's unlawful confinement. Should be a human rights violation. It is a human rights violation, just nothing's been done about it yet. So migrant workers are vulnerable workers, just like non-unionized employees in the service sector, inmate workers in prisons, or the gig economy. There's so many vulnerable workers in our society. Migrant workers are amongst the most vulnerable of these groups of workers. For a worker-centered recovery, it must not be returned to the so-called normal, as Christine referred to. And as Jason referred to, speaking of the importance of when workers are more organized as a whole, when workers are more unionized, everyone is brought up. So this is a call not just to help with migrant worker organizing and support migrant worker organizing, but for everyone to get organized so we're all brought up together. And that's what I'd like to say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Asaf. I think that leads really well into my next question about who's been affected and how have different groups of workers and residents of our province been affected differently. Because as you just mentioned, I mean, clearly one group, migrant workers, very different impact than someone that's picking up and able to work remotely over Zoom from their cottage. So so I guess that's the question I have for whomever would like to pick up on it first. Like, how have the pandemic effects been felt differently by different workers and in different industries?
As you know, Govind, at the Workers Action Center, we hold monthly clinics. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we got a huge influx of people coming in and asking us about whether or not they can be put on layoff. And then we didn't get a whole lot of people calling us for a few months. And then when work started picking back up again and employers started re-employing people, we got a whole bunch of people calling and saying, can my employer not bring me back from layoff and bring everybody else back except me? And what I think the pandemic exposed, and Christine touched on this earlier, and I think you did as well, Asaf, is that people's vulnerabilities that already existed, the cracks that already existed, were exacerbated, were opened up even more. And it became more and more obvious to us, at least, and I think to a lot of people, where vulnerability existed when things go wrong in society. The people that bear the greatest burden and their vulnerabilities are exposed the most, they experience the most difficulty. So the people that we were seeing were of course people who don't have a guarantee that they'll be reemployed after being laid off, which is essentially the vast majority of non-union employees. Union employees obviously generally have a layoff procedure based on seniority that your employer has to call you back in line of how long you've been there. There's a system for fairness, whereas most non-union employees don't have that guarantee. Furthermore, their employers are often less afraid to take advantage of them, not call people back in the right order, knowing that their recourse is very limited. They're not going to hire a lawyer and spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to file a lawsuit against the employer. They don't have easy access to a grievance procedure. So in my experience, what the pandemic did is basically just show us on its face very plainly who is the most vulnerable and who is the least vulnerable.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, I've heard that same thing, that friends of mine who've said that the boss used as a chance to cull workers from the workplace in unorganized workplaces. Yeah. Christine, do you want to go next? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd love to add to what Jason has talked about and Asaf around what the impact has been for different workers. This is not an economic recession, this is a pandemic, and we had a shutdown of the economy in response. And so the impact that it had depended on where you were in that economy, right? And so we've heard the impact on migrant workers and temporary workers and precarious workers and sex workers and gig workers. But because of the virtue of who works in those jobs, we also know that those who are doing the frontline essential work, right? From the food processing to the grocery store to warehouse to the care sector, home care, long-term care, childcare, those are female dominated, most of them. Over half of all of our female workers are actually in what we call the 5 C's, in the caring, the clerical, the catering, the cashiering, and the cleaning. In Nova Scotia, 95% of our home care workers are women. So we know that, the impact that this pandemic has had a specific impact on women in particular, not just because initially they would have lost their jobs. some of them in the service sector, but they've also faced extra care work at home because childcare was also shut down, schools were shut down, they faced homeschooling, and of course many of these women were essential workers, and so they were also risking paid work. So that's one thing that the research is showing us that happened as the economy shut down, and what it's also showing as the economy comes back up, women aren't catching up as quickly as men are. The other group that I'd like to mention is that, you know, those who face racism in our labor market and in our society are those who are also facing, as workers, similarly, more risk, right? Because they do also tend to be in those low wage work. So the other thing that the research tells us is those in low wage work, more of them lost their jobs. The higher up the wage scale you went, the less likely it was that you lost any hours, never mind lost your job. And we know that, you know, we have a higher proportion of racialized communities who work in low wage jobs. And we know that more of them have lost their jobs or lost their hours. And so, you know, that's important for us to understand. We definitely don't have enough data to tell us, and we need more, and that's part of the issue that we're facing as we try to figure out what the recovery looks like. We need to really understand what that impact has, but those are some of the things I wanted to flag.
Perfect. Thank you, Christine. It's interesting. It's like climate change. The poorest and the most vulnerable are bearing some of the biggest impacts of it. Asaf, your thoughts on like a specific, or who's affected and differently?
Yeah, I mean, just drawing on what Christine just said, as far as racialized workers, migrant workers in the province that I'm speaking about, they're all racialized. Farm work done by Mexican and Caribbean migrant workers, a lot of fish plant work done by Filipino and Thai workers. From what I understand, so there's that dimension. There's also just the dimension of looking at the nature of the work and just where you get relaxed rules. So in farm and food processing workers, there's relaxed rules regarding COVID-19 safety. So normal physical distancing requirements are not there. Just employers are supposed to just try their best to minimize situations where there's close congregation. And of course, we've seen what's happened with 1,300 migrant workers, farm workers alone have gotten ill with COVID-19, largely due to this situation. So there's that. And as well, you have the system of closed work permits being tied to an employer, coupled together with an inaccessible complaints process, works together, and it's like a double whammy. So you have, because workers on a closed work permit tied to the employer, concerned about losing the job, because then you also lose status in Canada and are returned to country of origin. Couple that with lack of access to a complaints process. To put those two together and see what you get, and you get a terrible level of exploitation where it's a worker who feels very vulnerable and feels compelled to do more work and work harder, work in dangerous conditions. And then when you can't access the complaint process, that it makes it even more out of reach, means it's even less likely that you'll have complaints come up. So this whole system is completely broken, and it's really designed for this kind of super exploitation I was speaking about. So I'll just bring those two up, and just one more. I'll briefly mention that not being allowed to leave farms. I mean, that should be, as already noted, I believe that's a human rights violation. How is that even happening? It has happened in Nova Scotia. So these are some ways that migrant workers are particularly being affected.
Thanks, Asaf. Thanks for that overview. One of the things that I think has been like clear to people watching government responses to the pandemic is the federal government's been very active. I mean, I mean, it makes sense in some ways because the federal government has the deepest pockets, the greatest, and you actually want the federal government in a crisis to be most active and intervening to support incomes and to support economic activity. But just focusing on the Nova Scotia provincial government, I mean, how would you assess the provincial government's response to support workers and support Nova Scotians, retirees, others who have been affected. Like how has the provincial government's support for working people contrasted with its support for business, or its concern about, you know, people with wealth to protect? So whoever would like to jump in there first, go ahead. I see Jason.
I think on its face, I don't have a lot to say about the provincial response, but the federal response I found really interesting, because on its face, the CERB seems great, right? Give people money. Just give people money. They can spend it in their communities. They can live. They can get by. They can pay their rent. But then when you look at how those programs are provided and you contrast that with how business is supported, working people are looked at with an eye of suspicion. Working people who are provided something like money in particular is the biggest one, because people think, what are you going to spend that on? Working people are always looked at with suspicion and always considered or always required to fulfill certain prerequisites to get access to that money. The CERB is really, really funny because the requirements provided employers with a way to use the CERB as a cudgel against workers who were non-compliant. So you heard business with all these ludicrous talking points about how people are never going to go to work again. They're going to stay home because they can collect the CERB, play video games, and eat Doritos. That's not how it works. That's not how it works at all. If the employer recalls an employee and the employee says, oh no, I'd rather stay home and play video games, well, that employee's technically resign their employment and they could be disentitled to the CERB. Similarly, the employer, and I talked to people who this happened to, the employer said, well, I want you to work 4 shifts this 1 week, but that's it, go back to whatever you do at home. And the employee would have been put over the $1,000 limit in your income. So they said to the employer, well, I'm going to be disentitled to the CERB for what, 2 extra shifts making minimum wage. It'll get me just over $1,000. But the employer said, okay, well, if you don't come back to those shifts, now you've resigned. We'll report that. We'll issue an ROE based on your resignation to Service Canada, and you'll be disentitled to the CERB. You'll have to pay it all back at the end. Presumably, we don't really know how that's going to work. Yeah. But the CERB, it was so funny because the idea is so fundamentally good, giving people money, but the implementation is so so suspicious of working people and so so unfriendly to working people and always so friendly to employers and their interests. So it was interesting, but and a good idea, but just not well implemented for working people.
When businesses act rationally to improve their bottom line, they're just being good economic actors. But when workers say, well, I would lose $800 if I took this shift, they are somehow being like just greedy bastards.
They're lazy, yeah, lazy greedy.
Christine, Asaf, why don't you jump in and you have some thoughts on nope, you're still muted.
I always forget that. So yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on that. As far as the federal government, I mean, just go from the outset, farmers, others who relied heavily on migrant workers complained about not having a labor force to do the work in their workplaces. And it was really in response to these employers that the federal government decided, okay, yes, now we'll allow workers to come in. But did they really do anything to address health and safety issues like in a major way? No, they didn't. Did they, for example, making sure that there was proper physical distancing, that bunkhouses where migrant farm workers stay actually could only have a minimum number of people in instead of cramming so many people together where it's impossible to physically distance? Like, that's the federal government's responsibility. They didn't really do anything about that. They just, left it to provinces to perhaps do something. So the federal government's response to migrant workers really hasn't been there, and of course they haven't responded to the permanent residence status for all, which is crucial right now. As far as the province's response, I mean, this is both like federal and provincial, where when you have this advance notice of inspections, I mean that's really a favor to the employer. Hey, we're going to come in and do an inspection. Okay, sure. And then the employer is ready for it, and then telling migrant workers to behave and not say anything, to say everything's great and all that to keep your job. I mean, that is clearly like entirely one-sided. there's no reason to have advance notice of inspection other than to do a favor for the employer. And that is something that, again, there's been a widespread call across the country to change that. Of course, nothing's been done about it yet. There has been talk of unannounced inspections, but in Nova Scotia this past summer, there was an announced inspection, and the response at Ballamore Farm, some people might have heard the media reports about that, was migrant workers were saying they were told to keep quiet, otherwise they wouldn't be around any longer. So that's what I'd say is a couple of key issues, or a couple of key issues of like a favor to the employer and disadvantage to workers.
Perfect, thank you. So Christine, what are your thoughts?
Just adding to, well, kind of the contrast between, and I'm going to focus on the provincial government in particular, but between business support and support for everyone else. So somebody had asked me this question before, you know, can I put the numbers together? And in fact, I can't, because our government, as always, is obfuscating exactly how much it spent. It gives us global numbers. But here's the thing. I know that at least 161 million went to support small, medium business. 9 million went to actually provide them with rent relief, the businesses. No rent relief for people. The only thing that people got was eviction deferral, you know, because we shut down the boards. You couldn't actually, the landlords couldn't actually go and try and evict. And then this, I don't know, edict, we'll call it, not law or anything, but an edict from the government asking landlords, you know, to negotiate that back pay, make a deal with their tenants, and not to evict them if the reason they didn't pay the rent is because their income was impacted by COVID. Similarly, you know, the federal government did kind of the same kind of dance with the banks around if people needed something around their mortgage relief. Well, you know, we would ask them nicely and maybe they would do that. The only actual money that the provincial government gave directly to people was $1,000 one time to people who qualified for CERB, but only the lowest income workers. I think it was 34,000 was the cutoff for that. And then one time, I think it's $50 for income assistance recipients who, if they were working, were actually cut off from income assistance entirely if they were eligible for the CERB. So they apparently still qualified for farmer care. That was their, you know, we'll allow that. But really, at the end of the day, I mean, if we're grading them, what is it, an F? Oh, and I laughed today because I was directed to the website for the loans and the grants for businesses. Here's what the website's called: honestmoney.ca. Like, I can't make that up. That's actually what it's called, from the Nova Scotia government site. honestmoney.ca, folks.
Well, that's our next board game, Christine, you and I. And, let's replace Monopoly. But I mean, I think that all of you are touching on the way in which we've been really poorly served by the story that Christine told off the top, where rich and powerful interests in Nova Scotia have done things like abolish school boards by fiat. And when you look at other provinces, and it's really amazing where provinces that still have school boards, school trustees have been very active in organizing consultations with parents, collecting concerns, and representing parents. And what an amazing idea that you could actually have, as a parent of school-age children, you could actually have a democratic representative that would go and take your concerns to the government or to the administration of the school boards. I mean, that is such a good idea. We may consider actually having that here in Nova Scotia one day. I mean, I know it could be dreamy and technicolor, but you know, couldn't hurt. And then, I mean, also things like, you know, if the communication structure in the province has been set up so that we have the highest internet costs outside of, you know, the really remote areas of Canada. And I mean, Nova Scotia, I think, is the second most densely populated province in the country. So we shouldn't necessarily have a problem with running internet, but you know, it's just, there's so many people that are not served. So I think that some of the things that I take from what you've said is it's some of it is follow through, and it's a follow through on the patterns that were set before. So kind of building on that, I guess the question is, where do you see this going in the next 3 to 6 months? Let's take the short to kind of medium term. We're going into the fall. I mean, I guess, I mean, it's not so much a medical question about, at least none of us know how bad a second wave is or that will be, but I'm interested in, what do you see as the challenges? I mean, for example, when the CERB expires, when people's mortgage deferrals come up, and how do you make sense of, like, I mean, I think a lot of people that are watching are trying to make sense of news today that the real estate market is on fire while we're in the middle of a pandemic. So where's it going to go? It's just going to go up and up and up, or what's the impact? So maybe we'll if people are okay with it, I'll go in reverse order this time. Christine and Asaf and Jason. So Christine, what are your thoughts on where it's going to go for working people?
I mean, it is hard to know. I mean, what I'm fearful of is that we're going to hear about austerity at some point. And so I think we really need to be wary of that. We already heard the mutterings of our outgoing premier that, you know, there might be sacrifices that are needed. We absolutely can't go down that road. I mean, we can't go down the road during a pandemic, but we just, you know, the pandemic exposed the social and economic conditions that existed prior to it. So the fact that our governments are at a point where, you know, I mean, look at long-term care and what happened, because we didn't actually invest in the infrastructure. We know that we will pay, well, we know the tragedy that occurred there. But we know that if our governments start to retract, provincial government in particular, not just retract, but if they don't actually invest, it will make things so much worse. Our economy needs people to be able to spend in it. And so, you know, the end of the CERB is a concern for sure. We are likely to see the employment insurance program strengthened, not enough. There will still be thousands and thousands of people in our province alone who will likely still not be able to get access to employment insurance. And so that's a big concern for people. You know, we shouldn't have any evictions during this pandemic. The pandemic will go on until we have a vaccine and longer. And until we are able to remove these restrictions that are necessary. So, you know, I'm very concerned about what our government's going to be doing next. And we cannot believe the story that we've been told about the debt and the deficit. Interest rates, it's pretty much free money for our government. They're not a household. They need to be investing right now. They need to be taking advantage of those interest rates and not going the other way. That's, I think, something that we really have to push back on and push hard.
Thanks, Christine. Asaf, what do you think? Where do you think what's going to happen in the next 3-6 months for workers? Is it going to, what sorts of things if it gets better? And you're still muted. You know, what sorts of things if it gets better or worse? What are you seeing?
Well, I'd like to just kind of draw on maybe this last part of what Christine said. Just that I think you know, it's there's going to be a fight. Without a doubt, there's going to be a fight. We know where things have been laid so far. Jason's referred to how the CERB is basically structured, not really in a way to assist workers. It's like another system of policing and surveilling workers with a minimal amount of money and watch how they're spending it, kind of thing. So I think that so far what we've seen are measures that are not really in favor of working people as a whole, and working people are going to have to fight. And there are people that are pushing hard. For example, the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, Justicia for Migrant Workers, who are working with migrant workers to organize and fight back, have been pushing the government hard. And now there's a a letter signed by 280 organizations across the country, overall representing over 8 million people that are pushing hard on the government to implement these demands for change. So we are seeing people respond. For example, in the prisons, prison justice and advocates, activists, prisoners, abolitionists fought hard to get people out of jails who were in jail pre-trial. And in Nova Scotia, a huge percentage of people were released because there was a huge push for that. It didn't just arise out of nothing. It came out of people pushing back. In Toronto, we're seeing countless numbers of tenants fighting back, saying they will not be evicted during a pandemic, or they will not be evicted at all, that they are going to push back against skyrocketing rents and unfairness that the whole system is exposing them to. So we are seeing people organizing and fighting back. Just got to get much, much bigger. And that's what I see happening. I see, you know, on, I guess, a positive note, nobody's going to sit around and watch this horror show. We're going to have to fight back. And I see the next several months being, how do we do that?
I think you're absolutely right. And before we go to Jason, I mean, the amazing thing is that, you know, the undemocratic tendencies of McNeil government and the ridiculously, you know, limited sittings, the NDP presented, you know, a very reasonable proposal that committees actually meet virtually. And the government said, oh, no, we couldn't possibly do that. We're in a pandemic. I mean, everyone else is meeting virtually. How is it that they get off drawing a salary and not actually like carrying out their democratic responsibilities? But I mean, it's a gift. It's a gift wrapped gift to McNeil in terms of someone who does not want to sit, does not want to answer questions. And I think that, as Asaf just said, I mean, it's about people pressing and keeping their feet to the fire to say, we more than ever, we need consultation, not only in the schools, like in healthcare, but generally. So those are some things I'm thinking. Jason, what are you thinking?
There's a basket of really, really good ideas that have worked in a lot of places, right? Really, really great ideas that would build an economy that works for everybody. Making access to unions easier, making unions stronger, universal healthcare, universal childcare. I mean, you can find them on policyalternatives.ca. They're all there. They're not hidden. They're not a secret. What we've heard from our government is a doubling down on ideas that have not worked. Withering of the state, lower taxes, more giveaways to corporations. Those things will not work for working people. We know it will, and they've said we're not going to do that. So it's going to be up to all of us to decide, excuse me, how the next few months goes. Is it going to go their way? Is it going to be more for the wealthy elites, or is it going to be more for working people and things that work for working people? That's an open question. I'm cautiously optimistic because our government has signaled to us very clearly it's not going to be more for working people. It's not going to be stronger programs. It's going to be more for wealthy people, more for people who don't work. So we'll see.
I mean, I think that, I mean, in terms of where it's going to go, I think all of you are saying it really depends on us. It depends on Nova Scotians, on unionized workers in Nova Scotia and non-unionized workers in Nova Scotia. And I think that what I've heard from you is that that really the government has been very successful in the past, driving a wedge between unionized workers and saying, look at these fat cats over here. They've got severance. They got all these other things that you don't have, and have been successful in splitting the working class in Nova Scotia, one against the other. And I think that that's, you know, I think that's one of the positive things of CUPE Nova Scotia hosting tonight's discussion, is that actually what I've heard is that, you know, what we need to do as unionized workers is figure out how we can make the links with non-unionized workers to fight back and against the coming austerity that we see coming. I would say to all, and I see Asaf your hand, I would say to everyone watching that we're getting close. We have one more question for the panelists, and then we will take questions from you. So fill up the chat window with your questions, and I will pose those questions to the panelists. So go ahead, Asaf.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more quick point. So the day after Labor Day, a group, the working group for migrant worker justice that I'm with, we've been waiting for a month for Labi Kasulis, the Minister of Labor and Advanced Education, to even respond to our open letter. Didn't even respond for a whole month. So we just showed up at the office on the corner of Spring Garden and Roby with a banner and with a letter, just delivering it and saying we haven't heard back. And then we heard back the next day. So the government was intent on ignoring and had to bring it right to their doorsteps. But I think it's an example of just needing to turn the screws and ratchet things up and apply more pressure, and it can start to yield results.
Perfect. Thank you, Asaf. And keep those questions coming. I see that Diane has sent in a question. And so for the panelists, the last question I'll ask you before we open it up is, we talked a little bit about what the federal and provincial government responses have been so far, and we heard a little bit from Christine off the top in terms of her vision, her idea of where we need to head. But what specific actions or responses do you think we need from the provincial government and the federal government to support working people? I mean, I think that will be great is if, I'm putting you all on the spot, but I think you can all come up with it. Like, what are your top three that you'd say, well, this is what we need to do? And, I'll give you one to start. I mean, clearly housing policy, like Christine said, one very specific thing is, like, we need to have very clear freeze on evictions, and more than that, there has to be rent control, because whose income's going up during this pandemic? It's not working people. So if I see Jason's come off mute, so why don't you start, Jason, with some of the additional actions or responses you'd like to see.
The Workers Action Center has a few prescriptions that we've suggested that would be really, really helpful. There's two really, really obvious ones, and they're kind of no-brainers, and they're really in the public eye right now. And that is, first, giving workers paid sick days. It's so obvious. There's no question. I think everybody agrees with this. You shouldn't have to choose between going to work sick and paying your bills. You should not have to work sick. Nobody should have to go into work sick. That's the first one. And it's such an easy change. It's such an easy 2 lines in the labor standards code. Everybody gets 10 paid sick days a year, or 6 paid sick, whatever we want it to be. It's an easy change. Employers bear the burden, and it's a floor created for all employers. So it's not like one employer is overly burdened compared to another employer. Everybody has the same obligation. The second one would be, and again, this is very, very obvious. It's not especially insightful, but a higher minimum wage. Again, I hate to piggyback on Christine's work, but the living wage in Nova Scotia is way above the minimum wage right now. Living wage in Halifax is just over $20 an hour, I think, for a family of 4 with 2 working people. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Christine. It's not $11.55 or $12.55 or even $15 an hour. That's been our demand for a long time. It's significantly higher than that. And again, that number is not controversial. No business lobby group is coming out and saying, well, actually, it's significantly less. It's irrefutable. There's no question. So those are two very, very easy, small labor standards changes that would make all the difference to a whole lot of people living in our province.
Perfect. Christine, what do you think? What are your thoughts?
All of those are on my wish list. And I'll add, okay, let me see. So yes, 2180 is the Halifax living wage. The lowest living wage in the province is 1765. So yeah, echo the minimum wage is absolutely too low. But I would say, okay, a few things. Let me pick. Childcare. We need childcare. We need a system of childcare where we pay those early childhood educators a decent wage. We need that now. We need those investments. So, our government needs to actually be stepping up right now. We've seen it do some investments in roads and et cetera, but we actually need investments in public services because we need to address both the income side and the cost side. And one of the ways obviously to address the cost side is to take things right out of the market so that we can get them for free, and we can get them for affordable, we can get them from government. So childcare would definitely be on my list of investments. I mean, you talked about the rental increase. That, I mean, BC did that. No rent increases during the pandemic, no evictions during the pandemic. BC actually, I would say, is the leading province in the country in terms of its responses, just immediate responses to the pandemic. It's provided more rent subs for people. It's done a lot of that. Sorry, wish list. I think, you know, we need to invest to ensure that people can actually afford, well, aside from shelter, childcare, transportation. What are we doing? We had free transit for a while there. People got a sense of what that is. Our drivers didn't have to bother with, you know, taking fares in. We need investment in our transportation, our public transportation system, to ensure that people get access to it. And of course, public health care. We no longer are hearing about pharmacare, but people are really needing mental health supports. Let's invest and ensure that people can actually get access to what they need right now. And we know that people are needing those are some of the things that people need, that our governments could be doing, aside from actually building affordable housing. We've been hearing that one for a while, and that needs to happen. Sorry, that was more than 3. Can't help it.
That's super.
I'll be quick about mine. I mean, because I already did it. I sort of cheated. I said my 4 things at the beginning. So, I mean, I already mentioned at the outset the importance of permanent residence on arrival, which the federal government can do, but the provincial government can support. Federal government has the power, but the provinces can apply pressure. Now, I'm just going to talk just very quickly about that and why that's so important, why that's the repeated demand over and over again. It is the linchpin of the super exploitation of migrant workers. This temporariness, these closed work permits being tied to the employer, it's all part of a system that has allowed an incredible amount of exploitation. And prior to 2006, most were coming into Canada as permanent residents. And after that, it was mostly temporary, and it's gotten bigger and bigger. Why? Because the federal government allowed it. Why? Because they wanted there to be a system where there's some workers who can be exploited, particularly racialized workers. So I'm just going to focus on that. That is really the linchpin. I'd like to focus on what are the really key ways, the key systems in place that are keeping workers down, and trying to focus on targeting those.
Super, thank you, Asaf. I'll bookend my first comments with, I mean, we can't finish this section without talking about long-term care and the need to bring the entire system into the public. It needs to be publicly funded, publicly managed, publicly administrated. And when we stop providing public dollars to for-profit companies like Shanex, like others, like GEM, we stop shoveling them public dollars for 15 so that they can run 15% profits. And that means, in my simple accounting, that means 15% more beds are possible for or 15% more staff. Like, you are cutting out the private fat and the private profit. So we have a lot of questions coming in. This is great. I'm going to group 2 together first. I kind of feel like they go together. And one question from Diane, where she says, how would you recommend rebutting the notion that provincial finances should be treated in the same manner as a household budget, especially when discussing with peers and members of our communities? And I'll add to that a question from Danny about looking for us to talk a little bit about corporate and business tax cuts that have happened in the past and what that's meant for lost dollars for government. So 2 kind of budget questions about the provincial finances and how much are they like the household budgets. I think, Christine, this is probably your wheelhouse, this question, and maybe we'll go to Jason for any comments. And the next question, we'll start with Asaf. So.
Sure. So, excuse me, our provincial government is indeed not like a household. They can tax, for one. And taxation obviously is critical. And so when we think about debt, debt is actually just really deferred taxation. If we're investing in post-secondary education, that means that the people who will benefit from that post-secondary education will be the people who will be paying the taxes in the future that we've deferred. We've decided that we will invest today, perhaps adding to the debt, but that people will reap that later. Unlike us, when governments spend, it means that actually revenue comes. A really good example of that is childcare. Quebec has shown us that childcare can pay for itself. There's nothing that we do that can do that, but our governments can actually invest in childcare, ensure that more people can actually be productive in the labor force. Those people are making income, government's getting more taxes, and that's paying for the childcare. Our government is part of a federation. Our federal government can actually almost exactly print money, right? These are bonds that we owe to ourselves. Interest is pretty much at zero for governments who are locking them in, and they're locking them in for decades. And unlike us, in decades when we're retiring and we're trying to do, that's not what's happening. Our governments are investing so that they will reap the benefits later. We all know what it means if we don't invest and we allow people to remain in poverty, that will actually cost us down the road. Some of that is common sense that we know as householders, but our government is very, very different when it comes to how we can deal with the spending and where the income comes. And I know that the question around tax cuts, our government cut corporate tax by 2% in the last budget. That's $70 million. Our government made changes to the tax system that they said would help the regular person in Nova Scotia. I'm sure that most people did not notice when their taxes were reduced by, and I can't remember what it was, an average amount, but the hundreds of millions that was taken out of our tax system meant that we couldn't then spend that on services. So I think that's don't know if that's a short enough answer to talk to your neighbors about, but I hope I've given you something to go on there.
Jason, I'm gonna ask you to pause because we have so many questions coming in. I'm gonna break, and each of you are gonna get a question because there's some that are kind of topic specific. So the next question will be for Asaf. So it's a question from Lisa about looking at across different provinces. Are there examples of better policies or practices around inspections of workplaces where temporary foreign workers are employed and living? Other than unannounced inspections, are there other changes the province could make to redress the power imbalance between temporary foreign workers and the employer? You're still muted. Yep.
Yeah. So there is an example in Ontario, not specifically about inspections. To be honest, a lot of research needs to be done on what's happening, where there may be some improvements in some cases, and to track that better. But I can mention one thing. On August the 28th, there was a decision at the Ontario Superior Court, which restored what was an order by the chief medical officer of that province, Dr. Nassetha Rai, that said there could be no more than 3 migrant workers to a bunkhouse. So that months ago, that was the order by the chief medical officer under pressure that there needed to be a limit on the number of migrant workers in a bunkhouse due to COVID-19 because of the necessity of physical distancing. But a particular firm challenged it and surprisingly won. And then it had to be appealed to the higher court in Ontario. And there was an intervention by Justicia for Migrant Workers and others. And they managed to get that. And of course, the chief medical officer and the government challenged it as well. And they won. So it was back to the limit of 3. So that is something that Ontario has done. Other provinces haven't. I'm not exactly sure where other provinces are on the limits in bunkhouses. But it's interesting what happened along the way with the farmer actually succeeding in overturning it. But luckily, or not luckily, it was because it was fought that it was restored to 3. So there's one example of a province that set a higher standard.
Perfect. Thank you, Asaf. So we have another question that I'm going to ask. It looks like it's in Jason's wheelhouse. It's a question from Janet. What is going to happen to workers that have no sick time or benefits, such as vacation or stats? these workers are being sent home with symptoms, and 811 can take 24 or more hours to reach, and testing can now take up to 4 to 5 days to get the results. So these workers are now off without any pay. And so what do you make of that, Jason? What's the background of that, and what's the solution?
Well, that's a huge problem. The good news is that there's an obvious solution to that. Is that the government's not implementing that obvious solution. The NDP proposed a bill that would have employees be guaranteed paid sick days, and the days that would be covered would include days that you have to stay home because your child is either sick or required to isolate due to somebody else being sick in the class or anything like that. So if you have to stay home because you or your family member is sick, you should get paid. You should be paid by your employer, and you should have a certain amount of guaranteed days. I would suggest something like 10 total in a year. Other people might have different ideas. That's an easy answer. Unfortunately, our government has not addressed it. They have not picked up on the NDP's bill. They've said, no, we're not going to provide paid sick days, and in particular, not in that broad of a scope. So the answer, I don't really have a good answer for you. You're right. Those workers are in a really, really tough spot. I would suggest the long-term goal for anybody in that situation would be to talk to a union about signing cards and joining up, because you need to fight back against your employer. You shouldn't be spending 5 days at home without getting paid. It's totally unfair.
It's one of the major challenges, and we need a mobilizing on that issue.
There is one thing. The federal government has introduced I don't know what it's called, another emergency benefit, but it's specifically for sickness. It's only going to allow for 2 weeks paid, but it still has to pass through Parliament. But that was what the Fed said that they would do, and it may be coming at some point. But as Jason says, we need a permanent solution. It's only a temporary one. It would only be for 2 weeks. And as Janet says, we need to ramp up testing, and we need to ramp up the response time to that. And we still haven't seen that. So that needs to happen. But there is a little something.
And you'll still have to apply. So it's not like you'll just get your regular paycheck. You'll apply, and then 4 weeks later or whatever, whenever Service Canada has processed your application, you'll get it. So,
And just to add to that, if I may, that there's been some serious shortcomings of that. I mean, it's something, but in order to even get access to the money, you have to miss a minimum of 60% of your work week to get the benefits for that week. And so it goes for a maximum of 2 weeks. So basically, if you miss a day, you get nothing. If it's not for COVID-19, you get nothing. So it's COVID-19 specific, and it's not employer paid, which means you don't get it right away. You have to, exactly what Jason said, you have to wait. So the thing people have been demanding is employer paid sick days, so you get it immediately.
Thanks for that clarification, Asaf. I had forgotten about that. There's 2 more questions that we're gonna do. One of them I'll take because it's on housing, and then there's one more that I'll throw to the panel. It's a question from Donalda. With skyrocketing rents and HRM, how will individuals who are unable to negotiate contracts for increased wages, and those who try to survive on minimum wage and with no cap for landlords with the rent increases, what can be done to stop this, and how can the public get involved? I remember talking a couple of months ago with a former CUPE member who's now moved on to another job, and unfortunately isn't a CUPE member anymore, but she organized a tenants association in her building on Gottingen Street in Victoria Hall, and fought off a 13% rent increase. I mean, the landlord still was able to get 4% or 5%, but I mean, it was through getting together with everyone else in the building and mobilizing and showing the landlord they weren't going to take that. But that has to happen not only in your building, but it has to happen clearly across the province. I mean, we need stronger tenants associations, and I think that this will become only more and more and more important as time goes on. I'm going to go to the one of the final questions that we're going to take, and then we'll do a little bit of a wrap, and we'll call Nan back in to thank everyone for participation. I have a question from Kenya, Kenya Thompson. Back in May, 50 members of the Senate wrote the Prime Minister calling for CERB to evolve into a minimum basic income. once the COVID crisis has abated. Do you think this could actually come to pass? And what impact could a minimum basic income have for helping Nova Scotians recover from COVID? So, Christine, of course, I'm going to throw this to you because you and I have talked about this. It's a tough nut to crack. I'm not sure that we've come up with a whole answer, but what do you think? I mean, this is a question that I've been hearing from a lot of people, that CERB could evolve into a minimum basic income. And I mean, I don't think anyone has any answers, but what are your thoughts?
Do I think it will?
Do you think it will?
No.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't. And if the Liberals come up with something, it will be a low minimum basic income. And so, you know, I mean, I just released sort of the living wage report, and part of what we do in that living wage is ensure that we talk about this partnership that does need to happen. We see it with the Canada Child Benefit for families with children. Government transfers are absolutely essential. We need to make sure that people are covered when they're unable to work, when they have additional expenses, and we need to strengthen our government transfers that exist, and we could do that right away. You know, our governments can move forward we've seen them do. They increase the CCB. The working income tax benefit hardly does anything at this point. Basic income is, in its simplicity, not simple. It could have the most far-reaching implications for everything. And our system needs to ensure that when we implement it, and as people continue to advocate for that kind of system that ensures we have a full social safety net with the services in the public that we need, that we move forward to make sure that it does have the impact that it wants. And for me, that number one is poverty. You know, we could tomorrow transform our social income assistance program, make sure that it actually provided enough support for everybody who needs it up to the poverty line. And we could make sure that we stop doing the kind of surveillance that we do. My concern with basic income coming from the Liberals is that it will be something that perhaps provides some subsidy to low-wage employers and takes any incentive out for them to increase wages, but that it will be their answer to everything. And the everything for me is those investments in childcare, in the public services, in pharmacare. We need to hear those as well, because we need to take those out of the market so that people can get access to them. Sorry, not a short answer, but
No, it's a good, not a short one, but a good one.
okay.
So what we'll do now is we'll give each panelist a minute just for some last thoughts, like in terms of something that you haven't been able to add in, or if you don't have anything to add, you can pass. But why don't we start with Jason and go Asaf and then Christine.
Public programs that we've talked about, like pharmacare, childcare, all that stuff, has two benefits. It's the program itself that helps workers get to work and get by, but also should provide good jobs. So if we're thinking about a recovery, policy prescriptions that are worker-centric, we need to remember that when those things are public, they provide really, really good jobs. So when Christine talked about the dystopian future at the beginning, the reason that it's so terrible is that there's no good jobs that come from any of that stuff. So as we're moving forward, I think we need to remember that the dual function of those things is really, really important. That not only do we get the service, not only do we get good healthcare, good childcare, but we get good jobs out of those programs.
Thanks, Jason. Asaf.
Yeah, I guess final thoughts. I mean, what really it's going to take, I think, has been echoed by many others already here, is just more organizing. And I think whatever we're doing has got to be bigger. There are union drives going on now. There should be more going on. There should be more organized workplaces. There needs to be more pushback against government, more holding their feet to the fire, more supporting the fight of tenants. Of course, tenants, working class people who are burning off all their money on ridiculous rents. It's all got to like come together in some way. So I think more opportunities to come together as communities to fight. And right now we see great examples of that happening with Black Lives Matter and other organizers, across not just the country, the world, who are fighting against the historical and present injustices faced at the hands of the police and the state, and doing really well at it too. So I think, plenty of examples are out there of how to bring communities together. I think we need to step it up on our end.
Thank you, Asaf. And Christine, your thoughts, closing thoughts.
I mean, you know, as a researcher, obviously I know that facts are not all that we need, but I hope that people get a sense of, you know, the myths and misconceptions that we are being told, and that we can actually push back, that we can make the case for that utopia that I actually also showed in the beginning. And I want to echo what Asaf just said and what Jason said as well. I think we should look to what's happening around Black Lives Matter, around supporting Indigenous rights, and the organizing that's happening, the quick turnaround of the just recovery proposals that are coming forward across the country, the solidarity with migrant workers. All of that is what we need to build on. It's such a good foundation for us to move forward and continue the work that we do, that we need to do clearly, to ensure that we don't go back to business as usual. We continue to push for a better Nova Scotia.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Christine. So now I'd just like to invite Nan for any final comments, or if you want to just throw out thanks to the panelists, you can do that too, whatever you like.
I very much would like to thank the panelists for sharing with everyone this evening their wisdom, and our marvelous moderator, Govind. Tonight is a piece of the story that everybody spoke about, sharing. And if everyone tonight on the webinar takes what they learned tonight and has a conversation with two people, and then they tell two people, we have to demand from our elected officials better. And we don't need to ask for it. We need to demand it. And if they don't give it, then we need to vote them out and vote in someone who will. Your vote is your most powerful tool. We have municipal elections coming up, and they will impact affordable housing and all of the things that are important to everybody that tuned in tonight. Get out, make an informed vote. Thanks for coming tonight, and we really appreciate you hearing what everyone had to say tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to CUPE Nova Scotia for organizing. Have a good evening, everyone.